The arrival of the war hero. The air aboard the battle cruiser Vanguard was thick with tension. The ship was parked in the cold, dark void of space, hovering just outside the war zone. Soldiers, each one a veteran of countless battles, gathered in the mess hall, preparing for the mission ahead. The crew was used to danger, used to the chaos of war. Yet, today was different. There was an unspoken fear among them, a sense that something new and unknown was about to change everything. The door to the mess hall slid open with a hiss, and the room fell silent. The crew, who had been talking amongst themselves, stopped in mid-conversation. They all turned to the entrance, their eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and unease. Standing in the doorway was a figure unlike any they had ever seen. He was an alien, but not just any alien. His tall, imposing frame was covered in a set of battle-worn armor, its surface scratched and dented from years of war. His eyes, glowing with an eerie light, scanned the room with a cold, calculating gaze. The soldiers who had been on this ship for months could feel the weight of his presence. This was no ordinary soldier. "Who's this?" whispered one of the men at the table. His voice trembled slightly, though he tried to hide it. "That's him," another soldier replied, voice low and serious. "The war hero, the one they say has fought on death worlds and survived. The one who led the charge against the Zarkan Empire." The alien soldier walked into the room with the steady confidence of someone who had seen horrors most of them couldn't even imagine. His reputation had spread across the galaxy. He was known as Kel, the alien warrior who had single-handedly led his people to victory in battles that most would call suicide missions. He had fought on planets where the environment itself was more dangerous than the enemy. He had survived in places where no one else could, and his name had become a symbol of fear for the galaxy's enemies. As Kel moved towards the center of the room, the soldiers couldn't help but stare at him. He had a way of moving, a fluidity in his steps, that made it clear he was more than just a soldier. He was something else entirely, something that struck fear into those around him. The crew had heard the rumors. Kel was not just a warrior. He was a legend, someone who had lived through the worst that the universe had to offer. A soldier sitting at the far end of the table, still skeptical of the alien hero's reputation, spoke up. "You've fought on death worlds, right?" The question was almost a challenge, but there was a hint of nervousness in his tone. Kel paused for a moment, his glowing eyes fixing on the soldier who had spoken. The room went still. For a moment, no one dared to breathe. "Yes," Kel replied, his voice low and calm. It was the kind of voice that demanded attention, but also instilled a strange sense of unease. "I've fought on worlds where the very ground beneath your feet is out to kill you, where the plants and animals are designed to tear you apart." The room fell silent again. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. They had heard the stories. Stories about Kel's battles on planets where the environment itself seemed to want to destroy anything that set foot on it. But hearing it from him, in his own words, made it feel all the more real. The rumors had been exaggerated, no doubt. But even the wildest tales about Kel's past had never prepared them for the way he spoke. There was no fear in his voice, no hesitation, just an unsettling calmness that made the soldiers uneasy. A veteran sergeant, who had fought in the galaxy's toughest wars, cleared his throat. "So, tell us then," he said, trying to hide the fear in his voice. "What's the real story behind these death worlds? What's out there that makes them so dangerous?" Kel turned his gaze towards the sergeant. His eyes locked onto him. And for a moment, the room felt colder. The war hero took a slow step forward, his voice dropping even lower. "There are worlds out there," Kel began, "where the planet itself is a living weapon, where the very air you breathe can kill you, where the ground can swallow you whole. On death worlds, survival is the exception, not the rule. I've seen things, creatures that can tear through metal with their bare hands, plants that poison you just by brushing against them, and storms that can level entire cities. The soldiers listened intently, but they couldn't shake the feeling that Kale was only scratching the surface. He wasn't telling them everything. There was something else, something darker, lurking beneath the surface of his words. One of the younger soldiers, eager to prove himself, spoke up. "And what about the myths? The legends about these places? They say there are things on Dithworlds that shouldn't even exist." Kale's expression hardened. "The myths are real," he said flatly, "and the things you've heard are nothing compared to the truth. There are weapons buried beneath the surface of these worlds, weapons that could end entire civilizations. The kind of weapons that the galaxy has forgotten about. Weapons so powerful, they make the strongest armies seem like children playing with toys." The room was silent. The soldiers were now on edge. What kind of weapons was Kale talking about? And why was he telling them this now? "We're about to go into a war zone," Kale continued, his voice now filled with a cold edge. "But the real war is just beginning. You'll see soon enough. And when you do, you'll wish you never heard the name Deathworld." With that, Kale turned and walked to the far side of the room, his words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. The soldiers were left in stunned silence, the weight of his words sinking in. They had thought they were ready for anything. But now, they weren't so sure. The war hero had arrived, and with him came the terrifying truth about the Deathworlds, a truth that would change everything. And none of them knew what was coming next. The tales of Deathworlds. The next few hours aboard the Vanguard were filled with an eerie silence. The soldiers were still shaken by the words of Kale, the legendary war hero who had just arrived. The atmosphere on the ship felt different now, heavier, almost as if the ship itself was holding its breath. The men and women who had once boasted about their victories, their expertise in battle, now felt small and uncertain. Kale didn't speak again for some time. He remained in his quarters, leaving the rest of the crew to stew in their thoughts. It wasn't until the following day, when the ship neared the planet's atmosphere, that Kale emerged once more. The soldiers had gathered in the briefing room, ready to begin their final preparations before entering the war zone. But Kale's presence filled the room the moment he walked in. He moved slowly, deliberately, his eyes scanning each soldier as if he could see straight through them. The tension in the room was palpable as the crew braced themselves for the upcoming mission. "Everyone, listen up," Kale's voice echoed in the small dark room. He stood at the front, his back straight, his expression unreadable. "You're about to face something far worse than any enemy you've ever encountered." The soldiers exchanged nervous glances. They had fought in countless battles, against alien forces, monstrous creatures, and hostile environments. But the way Kale spoke made it clear that this mission would be different. Kale didn't waste time with formalities. He simply began to talk about the Deathworlds. His voice was calm, but there was a sharpness to it that sent a chill down the spines of even the most hardened warriors. "The Deathworlds aren't just planets," Kale said. "They are living, breathing creatures. Everything on those worlds is a weapon. The plants, the animals, even the soil itself. Everything has evolved to destroy, to kill. The environments are more dangerous than any enemy you've ever faced." The soldiers listened intently, hanging on every word. This wasn't like anything they had been taught in military school. This was something far darker, something they couldn't even begin to imagine. Kale continued, his voice growing colder as he recounted the terrifying facts of his battles on Deathworlds. "The air itself is toxic on some planets. You'll suffocate long before the enemy gets to you. And when you think you've escaped, the creatures in the forests or deserts will hunt you down. Some of them are invisible. You won't even know they're there until it's too late." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. Some of them were veterans, tough and experienced, but none of them had ever faced anything like this. "Surviving on these worlds isn't just about weapons," Kale said, his voice growing more intense. "It's about your mind. The mental strain is enough to break any soldier. You won't just be fighting enemies. You'll be fighting against the planet itself, against the elements, the creatures, and the very land that wants to swallow you whole. Kale looked at the soldiers, his gaze hard and unyielding. I've seen entire battalions go in, expecting to fight a war. Instead, they were consumed by the planet. The planet doesn't care if you're a soldier or a civilian. It wants to kill you. One of the younger soldiers, a man named Jorik, spoke up. But how did you survive? What makes you different from the rest of us? How can we hope to survive against something like that? Kale looked at Jorik, his eyes narrowing slightly. I'm not different, he said quietly. I've just been trained by death. I learned how to adapt, how to fight back, and most importantly, how to think like the enemy. The planet will attack you in every way possible, and if you're not prepared for it, you'll die. That's the reality. The room fell into a heavy silence. The soldiers didn't know what to say. Some of them wanted to ask more questions, but they could see that Kale was only giving them fragments of the truth. It was as if he was holding something back, something far darker than even the horrors he had already described. Kale's eyes swept over the room one last time before he spoke again, his voice low and almost threatening. If you think you can march into the death worlds like any other battlefield, you're wrong. You'll need to rely on everything you've learned, every skill you've developed. And even then, it may not be enough. Remember this. When you step onto that planet, you're not just fighting enemies. You're fighting against nature itself. And nature always wins. With that, Kale turned and walked out of the room. The soldiers remained silent, each lost in their own thoughts. No one dared to speak for several long moments. The reality of what they were about to face had just set in. The ship's captain, a seasoned veteran named Captain Thorne, broke the silence. Prepare yourselves. We've got a war to fight. And we can't afford to fail. But even as he spoke those words, the crew knew that they were walking into something far worse than they had ever imagined. The death worlds were waiting, and no one was truly ready for what was to come. Kale had warned them. But would they be able to survive the horrors that awaited them? Only time would tell. As the Vanguard descended through the atmosphere of the hostile planet below, the soldiers felt a weight settle over them. The moment they stepped onto that ground, they would be fighting for their lives, and possibly their very souls. The descent into chaos. The Vanguard rumbled as it cut through the planet's atmosphere, the ship's massive engines straining against the intense heat and pressure. Below them, the planet loomed, a vast, unforgiving world that was as dangerous as it was unknown. The soldiers had been briefed. They had been trained, but nothing could prepare them for the horrors of what they were about to face. As the ship descended, the once steady hum of the engines suddenly grew erratic. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and ozone. The soldiers glanced nervously out of the ship's reinforced windows, their eyes scanning the alien terrain below. The surface of the planet was a mixture of red deserts, jagged mountains, and seas that looked more like oil than water, each one teeming with life forms that defied imagination. A deep, unsettling silence fell over the crew. This planet was unlike anything they had ever encountered. Even the veteran soldiers who had seen the worst of war felt a chill run down their spines. "We're entering the atmosphere," said Captain Thorne, his voice steady, but filled with tension. "Hold tight. Once we land, we move fast. We don't know what's waiting for us down there." The soldiers nodded grimly. The drop zone was located near a series of ancient ruins, a place that had once been home to an advanced alien civilization. But that was centuries ago. Now, the place was a deadly battleground where creatures, both natural and mutated, fought for dominance. According to the intel they had received, something much darker stirred beneath the surface, something that had been waiting for a long time. As the Vanguard hit the planet's surface with a thundering crash, the soldiers quickly suited up. They knew that what awaited them outside would be unlike any battle they had ever fought. They'd fought wars, been to the ends of the galaxy, but Kel's warning echoed in their minds. This was no ordinary battlefield. "On your feet," barked Sergeant Rogas, a no-nonsense soldier who had been in more than his share of dangerous missions. "We move in, secure the perimeter, and find whatever intel we can. Stay sharp." The soldiers filed out of the ship, their boots making heavy thuds on the cracked, dusty ground. The air was thick with a strange mist, a mix of toxic gases and dust that seemed to hang in the air, stinging their eyes. The temperature was unbearable, and the winds whipped up like sandstorms, blasting everything in their path. "Stay close." Cal's voice broke through their communication channels, calm and calculated. "And remember, this world wants you dead." The soldiers moved cautiously, their weapons raised, their eyes scanning every corner of the desolate landscape. The ruins in the distance loomed like ghostly sentinels, reminders of a once thriving civilization now reduced to rubble. What had happened to them? What had caused their downfall? And more importantly, what had been buried beneath the ground? As they moved closer to the ruins, the ground beneath them seemed to hum with a strange, unnatural energy. The soldiers paused, looking at each other with uncertainty. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up. They had learned in training that something as simple as the ground beneath your feet could be a weapon on a death world. Suddenly, a shrill sound echoed across the landscape. It was a high-pitched screech, so loud and sharp that it made the soldiers wince. From the corners of their eyes, they saw something move in the shadows. The ground trembled again, and then, out of the mist, came the first wave of creatures. The soldiers' weapons were raised in an instant, but nothing could have prepared them for what they saw. The creatures were massive, their bodies covered in thick, leathery armor. Their eyes glowed like molten fire, and their sharp claws scraped against the earth as they charged forward. These were not mere animals. These were apex predators, born and bred for one thing: to kill. "They're coming from all sides," shouted Sergeant Rogas as he fired a burst of rounds into the advancing creatures. But the creatures were fast, too fast for the soldiers to keep up with. "Stay together," Cale shouted over the comms, his voice sharp. "Form a defensive perimeter." The soldiers fired, but their rounds barely scratched the tough skin of the creatures. Cale moved with incredible speed, his battle armor making him almost invisible as he took down creature after creature with a precision that left the others in awe. The battle raged on, the soldiers firing as they retreated toward the ruins. But it was clear they were not just fighting animals. There was something more to this planet, something darker. The creatures weren't attacking randomly. They were organized, coordinated. "Get to the ruins," Cale shouted again. "Now, they're hurting us." Panic surged through the soldiers. The creatures were closing in, their speed and ferocity overwhelming the crew. It was then that the realization hit. They weren't just fighting for survival. They were being hunted. As the soldiers reached the ancient ruins, they found a narrow passageway that led underground. "Down here now," Cale barked, pushing the soldiers into the tunnel. They moved quickly, with the creatures hot on their heels, the sound of their claws scraping against the stone above them. The tunnel was tight, but it led deep beneath the surface of the planet, into the forgotten heart of the death world. Cale led the way, the glow of his helmet illuminating the path ahead. The soldiers followed, their breaths heavy, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had no idea what lay ahead, but one thing was certain: they were far from safe. The death world was only just beginning to show its true face, and they were about to uncover something far more terrifying than they could ever imagine. Cale turned to them, his eyes glowing in the dim light. "This is just the beginning. Keep your wits about you. What you're about to see down here is worse than anything you've ever faced." And as they descended further into the darkness, the soldiers couldn't help but feel that the true nightmare was only just starting. The heart of the death world. The darkness swallowed them as they descended deeper into the planet. The air grew thicker, heavier, and the walls of the tunnel seemed to pulse, as if the very ground beneath them was alive. Cale led the group, his boots clicking softly on the stone floor, his helmet's light casting eerie shadows that danced around the narrow passageway. The soldiers, once filled with bravado and confidence, now walked in silence, their movements more cautious. They had heard of the Death World's reputation, but nothing could have prepared them for this. The suffocating sense that they were intruders on a planet that would do anything to rid itself of them. "There's something down here," Cale muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning the path ahead. The others could feel it too, a strange energy in the air, a low hum that seemed to vibrate in their bones. One of the soldiers, Private Enos, glanced around nervously. "What is that sound?" "It's like the whole planet is breathing." Cale stopped, motioning for the team to do the same. "That's exactly what it is. The Death World isn't just a hostile environment. It's alive. The energy here is like nothing you've ever felt. It senses us." The team froze, their weapons raised, eyes darting from side to side. They had entered the belly of the beast, and they were now surrounded by the unknown. "We need to keep moving," Sergeant Rhodus said, his voice low and steady despite the growing tension. "The deeper we go, the harder it will be to escape if things go south." The soldiers nodded, reluctantly continuing their descent, their minds already racing with the possibilities of what awaited them. Cale's warning had been clear. This planet was more than just dangerous. It was an ancient, sentient world capable of things that no one could understand. The ruins beneath their feet were a graveyard of forgotten civilizations. But what was buried here? What had once called this place home? As they moved deeper, the tunnel opened into a large cavern, and the soldiers gasped as the light from Cale's helmet revealed the sight before them. The walls of the cavern were covered in strange symbols, ancient and unreadable. At the center of the cavern was a massive stone structure, its surface covered in a thick, pulsating moss that seemed to shimmer with an unnatural glow. "What is that?" Private Enos whispered, his voice shaking. Cale's eyes narrowed as he examined the structure. "That's not just a building. It's a weapon." The realization hit them all at once. The Death Worlds were not simply worlds full of dangerous creatures. They were designed, engineered. And this structure, this ominous monument, was the heart of it all. A low rumble shook the ground, and the soldiers immediately raised their weapons, instinctively preparing for an attack. But it wasn't the creatures that emerged from the shadows. Instead, it was something far more unsettling. A voice, deep and resonant, echoed through the cavern. It wasn't the voice of any alien species they had ever encountered. It was the voice of the planet itself. "Who dares to disturb the slumber of the ancients?" The voice boomed, sending a chill through the soldiers' spines. The air grew thick with the presence of something vast and powerful. The soldiers took instinctual steps back, their hands tightening around their weapons. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. They had awakened something that had lain dormant for eons. Cale remained unfazed. He looked directly at the glowing structure and spoke with the same calm authority that had gotten them this far. "We are not here to disturb. We are here to survive. Tell us what you are, and we will leave." The voice responded with an eerie laugh, deep and rumbling, like the sound of mountains shifting. "You think you can leave. Once you have entered the heart of the Death World, you are bound to it. There is no escape. There is no return." Cale stepped forward, his gaze never leaving the structure. "We are humanity, and we don't give up." The ground trembled again, and the walls of the cavern began to shift. Strange shapes emerged from the shadows, not the monsters the soldiers had feared, but humanoid figures, their bodies covered in dark, swirling energy, their eyes glowing with malevolent power. These were not living creatures. They were manifestations of the planet itself. The soldiers braced for combat, but Cale held up a hand to stop them. "These are not enemies. They are the guardians, the keepers of the planet. They won't harm us unless we force their hand." The guardians circled around them, their movements fluid and precise. Their eyes never left the soldiers, but they didn't make a move to attack. Instead, they surrounded the stone structure, as if they were waiting for something. Cale glanced at his team. This is the core of the Death World. It is the source of its power, the reason why this world is so dangerous. The Guardians are its protectors. They will not allow anyone to take what is here. One of the soldiers, a young recruit named Hylia, spoke up, her voice trembling. What do? We can't fight something like this. We're not even sure what it is. Kale turned to face her, his expression calm but serious. We don't fight it. We understand it. Suddenly, a new voice cut through the tension. This time, it wasn't the planet speaking. It was a figure stepping from the shadows. A being that none of the soldiers had seen before, dressed in ancient flowing robes. Its face was hidden in the dark hood, but its presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of power. I am the last of the ancients, the figure said in a voice that resonated through their very souls. And I have waited for the ones who are worthy of wielding the Death World's power. The soldiers were taken aback. Worthy? What did that mean? What power did this mysterious being speak of? But Kale wasn't surprised. You've waited for humanity, he said, his voice steady and filled with understanding. You know we are the ones who will take your power and use it. The figure nodded. Yes, the Death World was created as a weapon, a force that would either destroy or create. For too long, it has been dormant, waiting for a species strong enough to wield its power. The soldiers exchanged looks of confusion, their minds racing to understand the situation. What was this planet's true purpose? And what did it mean for humanity's future? But one thing was clear. Whatever lay ahead, humanity was no longer the prey. They were the hunters, and they had just entered the most dangerous game the galaxy had ever known. The true war for the galaxy was about to begin. The awakening of the Death World. The air was thick with tension as the soldiers stood before the mysterious figure in the heart of the cavern. The last of the ancients, a being so powerful that its presence seemed to warp the very fabric of the Death World itself. The strange energy that pulsed through the walls, the vibrating hum beneath their feet, all of it intensified as the being spoke. Cal's voice was steady, unwavering, as he addressed the ancient's messenger. You've waited for us. But for what purpose? What is it that you want from humanity? The figure did not immediately respond. Instead, it turned, its cloak swirling as it moved toward the massive stone structure at the center of the cavern. The Guardians, who had been silent until now, parted to allow it access. They knelt, their glowing eyes fixed on the figure as if awaiting an order. Slowly, with the grace of someone who had seen eons pass by, the being placed a hand on the structure's surface. The pulsating light dimmed, then surged back to life, brighter and more intense than before. The air around the cavern seemed to crackle with energy, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. The soldiers braced themselves, unsure whether this was a sign of something ancient awakening or something far worse. The figure turned back to Kale and the soldiers, its face still hidden in the dark hood. The Death World is not simply a planet. It is a weapon, an ancient tool created by my kind. It was designed to destroy the weak, to test the strength of the worthy, and to reshape the galaxy. Cal's brow furrowed. You want us to use it, to take control of this weapon? Yes, the figure replied, its voice like the whisper of a storm. You see, humanity is the only species strong enough to wield such power. The Death World was created to cleanse the galaxy, to weed out the unworthy. But it has been dormant for too long. It has seen civilizations rise and fall, but none have been able to control its power. Until now. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. What did this mean for them? They were warriors, trained to fight, to conquer. But this was beyond anything they had ever imagined. Why us? Private Enos asked, his voice full of skepticism. Why choose humanity? Why not one of the other species in the galaxy? What makes us different? The figure stepped closer, its movements deliberate and slow. You do not see it yet, but you will. Humanity has the heart of a warrior. You fight not just for survival, but for something greater. Your kind has the potential to bring balance to the galaxy, if you choose to. If you dare to unlock the power within the Death World. Kel's eyes narrowed. He had known from the beginning that there was something special about humanity, something that made them stand out among the stars. But he hadn't expected this. An entire planet, an entire weapon, just waiting for them to rise up and take control. Do you understand what this means? Kel said, his voice low. The power to reshape the galaxy. We could rule with it. We could conquer everything. The figure shook its head, its voice now filled with a deep sadness. No, it is not about ruling. It is about survival. The galaxy is dying, Kel. The power of the Death World is the only thing that can restore balance before everything collapses. But it comes at a cost. The soldiers felt a chill creep through them as the figure's words settled in. The cost. What kind of cost could a power like this demand? They had seen destruction on a galactic scale, but what could be worse than that? The Death World's power is not free, the figure continued. It demands the lives of those who wield it. To harness the full potential of its might, you must sacrifice something of yourselves. A life, a soul, a part of what makes you who you are. The galaxy will be reshaped, yes, but not without a price. Kel's heart raced. This was more than just a battle for power. This was a test, one that could end humanity's future before it even began. What kind of price? Sergeant Rhodes asked, his voice shaking with uncertainty. The figure's eyes glowed faintly as it answered. You must decide, Kel. You must decide if humanity is ready to bear this burden. Can you truly make the choice to sacrifice your own kind for the greater good? Are you prepared to give up everything to save the galaxy? A deep silence fell over the group. The soldiers, trained to kill, to fight, now faced the hardest decision of their lives. This was not just about surviving the Death World. It was about whether they could embrace its dark promise and pay the price it demanded. We cannot bear this alone, Kel said finally, his voice full of resolve. Humanity doesn't fight for power. We fight for each other. The figure seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding slowly. Perhaps you are not as ready as I thought. But the choice is still yours. You have awakened the Death World. You have awakened its power, but you must prove you can wield it. The cavern trembled again, the energy surging as if in response to the figure's words. The guardians moved, taking their positions around the stone structure, their eyes glowing brighter now. It is time, the figure intoned. Time to see if you are worthy. Suddenly, the ground beneath the soldiers cracked open, and from the depths of the cavern, strange, black tendrils shot upward, wrapping around the stone structure. The air grew heavier, the energy crackling as if the planet itself were coming alive in response to their presence. This is it, Kel said, his voice firm. We fight for humanity's future, and we fight together. With that, the soldiers raised their weapons, their hearts pounding with both fear and determination. They had awakened the Death World. Now, they had to face its full wrath. But as they stood united, one thing was clear. Humanity was no longer just a legend. They were the galaxy's last hope. The true test had begun. The Death World's wrath. The ground beneath their feet trembled violently. The tendrils of dark energy snaked up from the cavern floor, wrapping themselves around the ancient stone structure at the center of the room. The very air crackled with power, and the soldiers could feel it, a palpable energy that surged through their bodies, almost as if the planet itself was alive, judging them. Kel's heart pounded as he stood at the forefront of the group, the weight of the moment settling heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just another battle. They weren't fighting for land, power, or survival. They were fighting for the very future of the galaxy. The Death World had been dormant for millennia, but now it was awakening, and humanity had unknowingly triggered its rise. The mysterious figure, the last of the ancients, stepped forward, its glowing eyes now shining brighter than ever. The choice is yours, it said in its deep, resonating voice. You will either become the saviors of the galaxy or its destroyers. The Death World is an ancient weapon, a power that has been kept in slumber for so long, waiting for those worthy enough to control it. Private Enos took a step forward, his hand gripping his weapon tightly. His eyes scanned the dark, shifting tendrils, trying to make sense of what was happening. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath. "How are we supposed to fight this thing?" Kale turned his gaze to the group, his voice calm but firm. "We don't fight it, Enos. We control it. We've come this far, and we won't back down now. This is humanity's moment. We are the ones who will decide the galaxy's fate." The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. They had been thrust into the unknown, facing an unimaginable force, with nothing but their training and Cal's leadership to guide them. They weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for everything. Suddenly, the stone structure at the center of the cavern began to hum. The sound grew louder, almost deafening, as the dark tendrils twisted and turned, vibrating with an intensity that shook the very foundation of the planet. The ground cracked open wider, revealing ancient symbols and markings that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly light. "The power of the Death World is awakening," the figure intoned. "You must decide now. If you wish to harness its energy, you must be willing to sacrifice everything. The Death World does not choose its masters lightly." Kale clenched his fists, his mind racing. He could feel the power coursing through the air, the raw energy calling to him. But the figure's words echoed in his mind. Sacrifice everything. What did that mean? What kind of price would they have to pay to control this power? "We're not backing down," Kale said, his voice unwavering. "We will not run from this. We've fought too long, too hard, to turn back now." The figure nodded slowly, as if it had expected this answer. "Very well. Then prepare yourselves." Without warning, the dark tendrils surged forward, wrapping around the soldiers and the stone structure. The energy in the cavern reached a crescendo, and for a moment, it felt as if the very air itself was being pulled into the heart of the Death World. The Guardians, strange, glowing figures that had stood silent until now, began to chant in a language the soldiers didn't understand. The ground shook violently as the power of the Death World became almost unbearable. The soldiers gripped their weapons tighter, ready to face whatever came next, but Kale could feel it. The planet was testing them. It wasn't just an enemy they had to defeat. It was an ancient force that demanded respect. They had to prove themselves worthy, or they would be consumed by its power. The dark tendrils reached out, touching the soldiers' bodies, sending waves of energy coursing through them. It felt like fire running through their veins, hot and intense. But it wasn't just pain. It was a surge of power, a connection to something far greater than themselves. Cal's vision blurred as the energy coursed through him. He felt his mind stretching, expanding, as if he were becoming part of the very planet itself. He could feel the life of the Death World, its ancient memories, its power. He could hear the whispers of the Guardians, the long-lost voices of the ancients. They were all speaking to him, urging him to claim control, to take the power for humanity. But at what cost? Sergeant Rhodas staggered, his eyes wide with terror. "Kale, what's happening? We can't handle this." Kale reached out a hand, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind. "We can. We have to." Then something changed. The energy that had been surging through them suddenly shifted, growing colder. The Guardians stopped chanting, and the tendrils of energy withdrew. The planet had given them a test, and they had passed. But it wasn't over. Now, the figure spoke again, its voice full of both admiration and warning. "Now you must make the final choice. Will you take the Death World's power and use it, or will you walk away, leaving the galaxy to crumble under the weight of its destruction?" Kale stood tall, his body still trembling from the power he had just experienced. He looked at his team, their faces a mix of exhaustion, fear, and determination. He knew what they were all thinking. They had come this far. and they couldn't turn back now. "We take it," Kale said firmly, his voice resonating with authority. "We take the power and use it to save the galaxy. We are humanity, and we will not let the galaxy fall." The figure nodded slowly. "Then the power is yours, Kale. But remember, this power will not be easily controlled. The Death World will demand sacrifices, and you must be prepared to pay the price." Kale turned to his team, their eyes filled with both fear and resolve. This was no longer just about survival. This was about taking control of the galaxy's fate, and with it, their own. The true war had begun, and humanity would be the ones to lead it. The final confrontation. The soldiers stood at the precipice of history. The power of the Death World coursed through them, shaping their every move, pushing them toward an uncertain future. The air around them hummed with a low, ominous vibration, the energy of the planet alive and alert, as if it too recognized the gravity of the moment. Kale, their leader, felt the weight of the galaxy pressing down on him more than ever before. The Death World's power was within his grasp, but so was the fear of what might happen next. The figure, the last of the ancients, watched them with a gaze that seemed to pierce through time and space. Its words echoed in their minds. The Death World will demand its price. What did that mean? What was the cost of wielding such power? Kale turned to his soldiers. Each face was drawn, their expressions a mixture of awe and fear. They were no longer just men and women. They had become something else, something greater, but at what cost? Could they control the power they had unleashed, or would they be consumed by it? "We stand united," Kale said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty. "We have awakened this power. We have earned the right to wield it, but we will not fall to it. We fight for the future of humanity, for the future of the galaxy." His words rang through the cavern, a rallying cry that seemed to shake the very walls. The soldiers nodded, their resolve hardening. They were no longer afraid of the power coursing through them. They had faced the unknown, and now they knew what they had to do. But their moment of unity was short-lived. A distant roar shook the cavern, followed by a tremor that rattled the very foundation of the planet. The energy in the cavern began to fluctuate wildly, the air thick with an unnatural pressure. Cal's heart raced. This was it. The Death World was demanding something. The very fabric of the galaxy was about to be torn apart, and they were right in the center of it. A sudden crack echoed through the cavern, and the ground split open. From the depths of the Death World's core, a massive figure rose. It was unlike anything the soldiers had ever seen. A creature so large that it seemed to stretch beyond the limits of the cavern itself. Its form was a mass of twisting, dark energy, like a living shadow, its eyes glowing with the intensity of a dying star. The guardians stepped forward, their hands raised in reverence, but the figure did not move to greet them. It stared at Kale and the soldiers with an expression of sheer malevolence. This was the true force of the Death World, not just an ancient weapon, but an entity of destruction and chaos. "It is time," the figure's voice boomed, filling the cavern with a sound that reverberated through their bones. "You have awakened the power of the Death World, but now you must face its wrath. You are not the first to seek control, and you will not be the last. The price for wielding its power is steep, and you will pay it in full." Cal's heart raced. He knew they had no choice now. The Death World had already recognized them as its new masters, but it would not simply let them go without a fight. "We're ready," Kale declared, gripping his weapon tightly. The energy in the cavern surged once again, stronger than ever before. The soldiers raised their weapons in unison, their faces set with determination. With a deafening roar, the shadowy figure lunged forward, its form shifting and twisting as it closed in on them. The ground beneath them cracked open, sending shockwaves through the air. Cal's instincts kicked in as he shouted orders, guiding his soldiers through the chaos. "We fight for the future. We fight for humanity." The battle had begun. The Death World's wrath was fierce and unrelenting. Its form seemed to tear through the fabric of reality itself. bending space and time with every movement. But Kel's soldiers stood firm. They had been trained for this. They had faced impossible odds before, but this was different. This was the culmination of everything they had fought for. The galaxy's fate rested in their hands. Kale led the charge, his heart beating in time with the pulse of the death world itself. As he faced the massive creature, he could feel the power that surged through him, pushing him to fight like never before. The energy of the planet flowed through his veins, granting him strength, speed, and a clarity of thought that he had never known. With each strike, the shadowy figure recoiled, but it was relentless. It was the embodiment of the death world's fury, and it would not be easily defeated. The battle raged on, the soldiers fighting with everything they had. The cavern echoed with the sounds of combat, each clash of weapons and bursts of energy lighting up the darkness. But as the fight continued, Kale began to understand the true nature of the death world. It was not simply a weapon of destruction. It was a test, a trial of endurance and will. The creature before them was not an enemy to be destroyed, but a force to be overcome, a force that sought to break them, to test their resolve. And Kale knew that humanity's greatest strength lay not in their ability to destroy, but in their ability to endure, to push forward in the face of insurmountable odds. With one final powerful strike, Kale pierced the creature's form, sending a shockwave of energy through the cavern. The figure let out a screech of agony before crumbling into nothingness, its essence dissolving into the very air they breathed. Silence fell over the cavern. The soldiers stood panting, their bodies battered and bruised, but they had won. The death world's wrath had been quelled, its power subdued. Kale looked around at his team. They were battered, but they had proven their worth. They had overcome the greatest test the galaxy could offer. Humanity had not just survived the death world. They had conquered it. And as Kale stood amidst the ruins of the cavern, he knew one thing for certain. The galaxy had underestimated humanity. Now, it was time to reshape the galaxy in their image. The true legacy of humanity had just begun. The galaxy would never be the same again.